Welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Mideast News Hour. This week, I'm going to be joined by two of my really wonderful colleagues, Dan Diker of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and Professor Avi Bell from Bar-Ilan University and University of San Diego. And we're going to be talking about the uptick in the BDS operation against Israel on U.S. college campuses. But I think before we begin our discussion, I just want to mention, we're recording this show the week after, or a few days after, we had barbarous terrorist attack where 3 Jews were hacked to death by ax-wielding jihadists in the ultra-Orthodox city of Elad. And this follows a long list of terrorist attacks in Tel Aviv and Bnei Brak and Beersheba, and in Hadera, and then weeks and weeks of incitement and violence and terrorism by Muslims who were incited by imams, directed by Hamas, directed by the Jordanian government, directed by the Palestinian Authority in places like the Temple Mount, Joseph's Tomb in Nablus, and other places throughout Israel and throughout the Palestinian authorities in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza. So we are in a sort of, I don't know whether it's a spasm, but certainly an uptick in massive incitement, the kinds that we haven't really seen for years since we were in the midst of the Palestinian terrorist war against Israel, which started in 2000. At the same time that this is happening, very reminiscent of what was going on 22 years ago, we're seeing an uptick in anti-Semitic and anti-Israel activism on the left in its focal points in the media and in academia, and including in the Biden administration. So we're experiencing this uptick, and we want to talk today specifically about the escalation, or the seeming escalation, whether it is an escalation or not, we're going to discuss, of BDS activism, of anti-Israel condemnations in academia, in the universities. We saw both at University of Sydney and at University of Melbourne in Australia over the past week, resolutions to boycott Israel academia, to side with the Palestinians in their terror war against Israel were passed at both campuses. And then notably, Harvard's Crimson, its student newspaper, came out with a very strong, very pernicious editorial, unsigned editorial, very actively siding with the boycott of Israel, with the Palestine Solidarity Committee, which is an organization that seeks the annihilation of Israel, and also ascribed incredible bravery to anybody who would stand up to the cabal that controls free speech in the United States. Of course, that is the Jews, and how brave you must be in order to stand up to that. Because, now being anti-Semitic is so hard on university campuses. So I think maybe we should start with the contents of the editorial in the Crimson and talk about what's going on at Harvard. All 3 of us, by the way, are Harvard graduates, among our other sins. And so we're going to talk about that as well, and whether the things have changed or how much they've changed since we left 20, 30 years ago. So now I'm going to let you see my guests so that you know that I'm not just lying. So here we're in the gallery view of Zoom. Hey, Avi. Hey, Dan. Good to have you.
Hi, Caroline. Good morning.
So why don't we just open it up first with a question? The Harvard editorial really stunned a lot of people. You had liberal Jews on the left, like Alan Dershowitz and Lawrence Summers, a former president of Harvard, who was thrown out actually by the woke crowd back 20 years ago from his position, both coming out with op-eds against what they've done. But you also have Jews on Harvard campus, including one of the editors of the Crimson. One was against it, and another one said, I'm Jewish and I signed on to this editorial. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are we looking at? Is this an escalation? Is this an acceleration of anti-Israel campus operations? How do you guys look at it? Who should I start with? Let me start with Dan. You wrote an op-ed about it also at jns.org.
Yeah, very much. Actually, I wrote for Israel Ayom. I wrote an op-ed just hours within its taking place. I just want to mention what an honor it is to be here with Professor Bell, who's been a colleague and a teacher of mine for a number of years on a lot of these issues. So it's really terrific to be with you, Caroline and Avi. Let me just try to create for a minute and 20 seconds a little bit of historic context here. Harvard has been on a slippery, sliding slope all into a type of de-evolution of liberal thinking into progressive and radical thinking, which has infected the campus over the last 15 years. I remember back in 2012, Harvard University hosted something called a one-state solution conference at the Harvard K School. Offering,
when was this?
Back in 2012, when I served as the International Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress. And I led at that time, I led a very outspoken protest against Harvard University lending its official name and infrastructure. They lent the Kennedy School to what they called a one-state solution, a conference that was essentially a carnival of hatred against the existence of Israel. They didn't understand it then. They didn't understand that the word solution was used back in the 1940s as a final solution, and this was the one-state solution. And we've just gone further south since then. I was in touch with President Bacow 2 years ago, having written on behalf of the Harvard Club of Israel a very strong letter of condemnation of the fact that the Harvard Undergraduate Council awarded more than $2,000 in 2019 for the Israel Apartheid Week, which is clearly another carnival of hatred representing the Nazification of Israel. And President Bacow wrote a letter back saying there was nothing he could do. This was an expression of academic freedom at Harvard. And if they were to outlaw or prohibit the Israel Apartheid Week, what would that mean for any minority that wanted to hold a conference under the rubric of freedom of expression on campus and freedom of speech? So Harvard's
I don't want to interrupt you, but can you think of another minority? I mean, I'm not sure what a minority is. Is this the Arab minority of Israel? Is this the Arab minority in the land of Israel? But is there another minority that's asking to host or does host a month or a week or a day or an hour of protests calling for the annihilation of the majority of whatever country is involved? Is there another example that he could point to? Can either of you think of another example of something like this?
No, in fact, Professor Alan Dershowitz wrote on May the 6th in a stinging counter op-ed against the Crimson, the Harvard Crimson newspaper, full-throated endorsement of the Palestine Solidarity Committee and the BDS movement, that this is the only pro-Palestine, as they call it, or it's the only pro-movement in the world that's based on the annihilation of another people. So that would be the answer to the question. I don't think, unless Avi finds another example, there's no other example in the world of a pro movement for any national group or attempted an attempt to argue for a national group that's based on the politicide or the genocide of another people.
Okay, so having said that, Avi, you also teach at University of San Diego, and you're on U.S. college campuses at least one semester of the year, but you do a lot of work, not only as a professor in the U.S., but also as a lecturer. Do you see an acceleration, or how do you view this sudden apparent uptick where you have a student newspaper, which, the Crimson even acknowledged that, I think it was two decades ago, probably after the Durban conference, I don't know, they opposed as an editorial board BDS, and now they're turning around, and not only do they support BDS, they support it in a way that makes clear that they support the annihilation of Israel, and that they think that trying to in any way limit the aspirations or the goals of the Palestinian Arabs against Israel is a form of censorship, and it's evidence of a Jewish lobby or that's trying to censor speech. Do you see an acceleration here, or what do you think is going on?
There clearly is an interesting social phenomenon going on here where anti-Semitism is getting more popular on college campuses. I think the Crimson illustrates it, but it's not a straight line. The Crimson editorial is a very, very interesting piece, and it's an interesting piece because while it calls for economic discrimination against most of the world's Jews, and it does so on the basis of all these allusions, anti-Semitic allusions to insidious Jewish power and the evil of the Jewish state and the wanton cruelty of Jews. But it doesn't do any of these things directly. It calls for a boycott of the world's Jews, but it never defines the terms BDS. It assumes that everybody knows that. It incorporates by reference a display by the Palestinian Solidarity Committee and their display on the so-called Israel Apartheid Week.
Art, they call it art, right? They say
art, right. It's Jew-hating art. It's art in which it makes claims about wanton Jewish cruelty and wanton Jewish evil and the evil of Jews individually and as a collective. But it doesn't say any of those things either. A lot of the Crimson editorial extols their own bravery for allowing themselves to be exposed to criticism for being bigots. And it's clear, as Dershowitz wrote, that we're to understand that the evil Jews control so much power that they're going to punish the Crimson editorial board for publicly expressing their bigotry against Jews, even though we know, unfortunately, there's going to be little price. But all that tells you something, because this editorial is more than anything. It's not an argument. It's an exercise in virtue signaling, right? It's written in order to tell the crowd that they're interested in, that we're on your side against the Jews. Now, why would they think so? And I think that's because there's an atmosphere on college campuses, at least among a certain crowd, let's call them the woke crowd or the diversity crowd, that tells us that anti-Semitism is a core part of fighting for justice. A just society is one that punishes whites and punishes Jews, that upholds the rights of the transgender and a variety of other ethnic groups that have been given the honorary titles of people of color, like, for example, Arabs. Right. And this is the milieu. And if you want to understand it, actually, one of the more interesting comments was made not by the Crimson editorial, but by Amnesty International's personnel a few months ago, as they were defending their report, so-called, labeling Israel an apartheid state. There's one of the lead authors of the report, Luther, was interviewed in Times of Israel and was asked about the timing of this, what led to it. And he said, well, people are talking about it. And the question is, who's talking about this? Who is it that's mumbling, oh, Israel's an apartheid state? And it's not the governments of the world, right? You can see that government after government has been dismissing the report as preposterous, right? And it's clearly not the Jewish community. One of the things that the head of Amnesty International in the United States had to do was explain why we have to not pay attention to the opinion of Jews, because what they really want to think is what Amnesty International is telling them to think. No, where it's being discussed is this crowd. It's the progressive crowd, the woke crowd, the diversity crowd. Among them, they're in a competition to constantly top themselves. There was an interesting study published by Heritage Foundation a couple of months ago, in which they examined the Twitter accounts of diversity officers in U.S. colleges, and what they found was that overwhelmingly 96% have an obsessive negative focus on Israel. So, for example, one of the examples they said that they tweet much more about Israel than they do about China, and 96% of their tweets about Israel are negative, whereas 60-something% of their tweets about China are positive. It's not about human rights. It's not about their record. It's not about geopolitical importance. It's about signaling to the rest of this crowd, if you want to be a proper, woke, progressive diversity person, then you have to be anti-Jew. And that's really what's happening here. And the competition is such that, you know, last year you didn't have to say apartheid, but now Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have said it. And so you have to top that. And now that the Harvard Crimson has come out for BDS, not only is everybody going to have to top that, but they're going to have to come up with new and harsher forms of Jew hatred to show that they're running in front of the diversity crowd to hate Jews.
You know, before, but wait, let me just, actually, you go on. I want to just take it into the kind of the core premises of the woke revolution. What is the way that they view the world, and the centrality of hating Jews and of seeking the annihilation of Israel in the woke sort of governing philosophy, their way of looking at the world and how it operates. But before we move to that, what did you want to play off of what Avi just?
I just wanted to make one distinction, a nuance, and I think one of the things that Avi said is so important is that if you're Jewish in America, you're white privilege, and therefore you're by definition guilty.
I did not say that. That Jews are defined either as white or non-white, depending on who you want to hate. So there is no white supremacist who thinks that being white is good that would define a Jew as being white. It's only those who define Jews as being bad, whites as being bad, who will define Jews as whites.
That was my point.
Yeah. Okay.
No, that was my point. My point. That's exactly my point. It is it from the left, being Jewish is being white. Being white is being guilty. That is the governing critical race theory concept of wokeism. But having said that, let's bear in mind, there are a lot of Jews who are part of the progressive radical woke movement. The editor-in-chief of the Harvard Crimson is a Jew. Her name is Orly Rappaport, and she very proudly wrote on her Twitter account just the other day, "I'm so proud to be part of this thoughtful group," quote unquote, regarding their full endorsement of PSC and BDS. And the point that an additional point I think we have to make is this whole point about apartheid. When you Nazify Israel by using the word apartheid, because you can't outwardly use the word Nazi, even though they've described Israel as, you know, genocidal, racist, bigoted, war criminal, you're essentially trying to politicize anti-Semitism. Because the Harvard Crimson editorial said specifically in its second line, we of course oppose all forms of anti-Semitism. So we have to say, well, if the editor-in-chief of the Crimson is a Jew, and many people, including Peter Beinart, one of the worst adversaries of the Jewish people today in the Jewish collective today, are leading the so-called woke revolution. What is it really? Where are we really holding in terms of understanding, as Caroline just asked, the overall worldview? The overall worldview is oppressor versus oppressed. The worldview is that which Arafat expressed back in 1974 and then caused the 1975 UN General Assembly to pass 3379 with Zionism as racism. There's this notion that you're either a white oppressor or you're part of the colored black oppressed, and that's where we are with regard to Israel, which is so dangerous because all this BDS, PSC, Students for Justice in Palestine, is basically a pretext of incitement to mass murder once again, but it's being viewed, unfortunately, by many in the United States as totally legitimate political critique of a nation state in the international community. And
before we get to that, let me just, I want to actually, I think you're right about the oppressor versus the oppressed, but I've spoken about this in the past with our colleague and friend David Wormser, and I also saw a really interesting episode of Uncommon Knowledge with Peter Robinson speaking with Jordan Peterson on I was watching it last night, and Peterson was asked about the woke revolution and what it was, and he basically came to the same conclusion that Dave Wormser talked about, which is that it is a rejection of the Judeo-Christian foundations of the West, that that there's a spiritual underpinning, that we're under God, that you can't really understand freedom without understanding that we have unalienable God-given rights, etc. And that if you want to undermine that and embrace instead a Marxist understanding of the human condition and of the world, then you replace it with a Marxist idea of oppressor versus oppressed, that the history of humanity and also all societies, including a proper society, utopian Marxist society, is based upon power relations, and that until now it's been oppressor oppressing the oppressed. And the idea of a Marxist revolution is that the power equation will be overturned, and that the oppressed will oppress the oppressors. And so in this, if you're rejecting a Judeo-Christian foundation of Western civilization and you want to replace it with a Marxist concept, then you have to destroy the Jews. And you have to go after the Jews, because you can go after the Christians, but so long as you have this underpinning of the Bible and of the biblical people and of national self-determination with the Jewish state, then you're always going to have this prototype that you're going to have to rail against. And so here it's sort of like the collectivization of the Goldstein in 1984, that Israel is Goldstein and that it has to be destroyed in order to advance a totalitarian revolution. So that, I think that the basic argument, just to make it very, very precise, is that anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, the demonization, the Nazification of the Jewish state is central, which is why you see this obsessive compulsion to attack Israel by all of these diversity officers on college campuses. So because and this goes to the question of what you were saying, Dan, of, how do you discuss BDS? How do you view BDS? How do Jews view Israel and anti-Israel activism and what it means for them? And basically, it's saying that Jew hatred, the hatred of the Jewish collective, is not just, a regrettable aspect that you can fight on its own basis, but that it's actually part of the core of the woke revolution. First, let's turn to Avi and then go back to Dan. I just want to talk about this a little bit because it's important as I see it, because if anti-Semitism is core to the woke revolution, then you can't fight it only by fighting BDS. You'll never get at it because it's a core of a much larger whole. How do you view that, Avi?
So two observations first. So number one is there's a little bit of tension between the idea that the reason they're going after Jews is because they're going after Judeo-Christian civilization, and they're going after Jews because Jews are playing the role of the fictional Goldstein in the 1984 novel. Because one of them says they're going after Jews because Jews are a real target. Jews represent something important that they want to destroy. And the other one says they're going after Jews just because they need a scapegoat. They need somebody to hate, and Jews are the figure to hate. I think it's a lot more the latter than the former. I think that Jews have played that role in Marxism since Marx, right? Of the people to hate.
Why are they mutually exclusive, though, in your view?
Because there is nothing that we can do. If I'm correct, if we're simply the scapegoat, there is no way out of the Jew hatred. There is a group. This brings me actually to the second point. There's in Malcolm X wrote about these parlors in Harlem where they would offer the services of bleaching black skin so they would look more white. right? And he describes all the different ways that he looks at this. You know, it's pathetic, it's horrifying. One of the things about it is it's not, I mean, when you look at somebody like Peter Beinart, who's trying to bleach his skin, I don't think that you should hate Beinart for. You should pity him. He's a symptom of anti-Semitism rather than a creator of it. Right. Now, if that's the case, when you see, you know, a Harvard Crimson Jewish editor going and extolling why it's so brave for her paper to be anti-Semitic and why she's happy to be a part of it, it's because she's convinced that if she declaims the right things, if she declaims her hatred of Goldstein, then she'll be spared. And it's true that BDS is a movement not for universal economic discrimination against Jews, only economic discrimination against the overwhelming majority of Jews. And so it's possible to labor with this delusion that you're going to be among the Jews that are spared from discrimination. But I don't think that that's really going to last. And it's not going to last because ultimately it doesn't have anything to do with anything that Jews believe or stand for or act on behalf of. It's about being Jews. Right?
I think that that's true for white people too. I mean, I think, you know, there's this concept, right, that you have deplorable white people, and then you have people who are white who are allies of the oppressed. And at the end of the day, this is not a sustainable model, right? I mean, I don't think. I think
there's no such. I mean, there's no such thing.
Let me just finish. The woke CEOs who are pushing this, you know, this woke revolution inside of their corporate boardrooms, or the university presidents who are white, who are embracing and trying to ride this tiger of the woke revolution in their university campuses or wherever it is, or Hollywood executives. At the end of the day, they're going to be eaten as well. I mean, it's not just the Jews who are trying to ride this BDS thing that, you know, are going to be able to slide into positions of, you know, as a Jews who get to attack their fellow Jews. But as a white people are also going to have the same problem. And, you know, that's why I'm not sure that you're right, that the two, that being Goldstein and being a core part of the woke ideology are mutually exclusive.
There's no such thing as a white. I mean, there's no commonality of the experience of Italians and Mexicans and Russians and Scots in the United States. I mean, white is a category that makes sense only in a certain context, right? So of course it's only as a figure of hatred, right? There's no. White was a category of legal entitlement at one point, and then after the end of Jim Crow, it ceased to be, and now it's just a political term for striking either in favor of a certain kind of bigotry, if you're a white supremacist, or in favor of a certain kind of political hatred, if you're against so-called white privilege. But there's no content to it otherwise, right? Now, if you want to, what's going on with Jews is the same thing. It just, being Jewish has content. Mm-hmm. You know, there is a Jewish people, there are Jewish customs, there are Jewish beliefs, there's a Jewish religion. But you're right, and that's my point, is those have nothing to do with our place in progressive anti-Semitism. It has nothing to do with anything we believe or do, or our history or our heritage. It has to do just with we're picked out as a figure of hatred. Now, that also means, like, what can we do about this? Where ultimately we can't convince anybody within that movement to leave. We can fight them. We can embarrass them. We can make it painful to be in that movement. We can try to pressure people who are outside that movement to reject it and make it tougher for them. I mean, one of the problems we have is that even though the progressive anti-Semites are still a minority in the Democratic Party, they have the run of the land. And it's because people who are indifferent to this are boosting them. You know, Pelosi is not one of them, but she's boosting them. Biden is not one of them, but he's boosting them, right? We can't make any headway by trying to convince people like Ilhan Omar. We can make a lot of headway by making it very uncomfortable for people like Biden to boost the anti-Semites. They're the people giving a leg up to them. We have to make it more difficult for them to do that.
I think folks, I think we have to put Israel as the collective Jewish target back in the middle of this discussion. Because if we look in 2019, 2021, and then the first 6 months or first 4 months of 22, the unprecedented rise year to year, beginning in 19 from previous years and since 19 and subsequent years of anti-Semitism is all related to a demonization, dehumanization, delegitimization of the Jewish of sovereign Jews, and that is used as an excuse, as a pretext to attack Jews. With the argument that Avi, you and Caroline are making is very true, but I do think we need to understand that Israel is being used as the pretext and the context for the dehumanization and demonization of individual Jews in the United States and around the world. Is if we don't understand that, and if we don't understand that the Palestine Liberation Organization, the Hamas, and previous to that, the Soviet Union has used this argument for decades, then we're giving a pass to the ideological creators of this Jew hatred is a combination of the Chinese Communist Party, the Soviets, and the Islamists. We see the language in Haj Amin al-Husseini. We see the language in the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928 and its militarization in the 1940s and 50s by Said Qutb. We see it in the Arabic translation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was very broadly distributed by the Muslim Brotherhood. We see it in Soviet. Richard Kemp wrote a fantastic brief on this recently, about 2 months ago. We see this in basic Soviet literature, that the Jews are Nazis and that the Jews are evil, and this is exactly the type of political nomenclature we see today. And if we don't, I think we have to go in there has to be prescriptively a full court press on the Palestinian leadership who are. From which this is metastasizing. It's metastasizing in all of the Palestinian institutions that are being funded by the West. It's being advocated by the hundreds of Palestinian expat professors at the University of San Diego, the university at UCLA, at Berkeley, at Columbia, across the United States, and this is one of the reasons that Jew hatred is metastasizing under this mask of political critique of Israel, and pushed very much by Palestinian professors in the United States. I think we really have to put Israel as the collective Jew back on the map in this whole calculation.
I mean, that actually goes to a couple of things. One is, I think, first of all, I think it's important just to point out, and I think it should be widely understood, but just to make sure that everybody is on the same page that we're on when we say this, when you put Israel as the collective Jew, and you use Israel as it's an instrumental use of the Jewish state in order to demonize Jews wherever they are, in New York, in Paris, in anywhere, in Russia, wherever it happens to be. And what that means, though, for Jews is that nothing that Jews do in the Jewish state or outside the Jewish state it can impact this. We're not hated because of anything that Israel does. It's that they're using Israel, the concept of Israel, of a Nazi Jewish state, of this demonization of the Jewish collective as a Nazi state, as an apartheid state, as something that's evil inherently by its very nature and can never expiate its sin, that this is being used. And so it's an imaginary Israel. And as a result, this attempt by Jews, if you want to look at it in sort of an innocent way, which I don't, but if you wanted to understand or place people like Orly Rappaport or Peter Beinart into a into a cognitive context that would in some way explain what they're doing, that they're trying to get out from under this Jewish guilt. They've accepted this idea that there's something, they've internalized this, or to the contrary, they think that, well, maybe Israel is doing things that are wrong, and if we point them out in a very harsh manner, that we are going to be able to expiate the collective guilt that they're placing on the Jews. In other words, it's not about the Jews, it's about the Jew haters. They're the ones doing the demonization, and there's nothing that Jews can do as individuals or as a collective to get them off our back. It's not about proving that our sincerity in wanting peace and our peaceful intentions towards the Arabs, or the moral way in which we wage war, or anything like that. There's nothing that Israel can do. I mean, that's your essential point. And then that really brings us to, first of all, in the United States, and even in, other Western countries, the CRIF in France, and the Zionist Council in Britain and in other places, in Australia and Canada, and how are they responding to this? And are they understanding what's at stake? And do they care? Is there too much Jewish support or too much Jewish identification with the woke revolution to enable Jewish institutions to actually act firmly in defense of Jewish rights, whether in Israel or in any of the separate states of the diaspora? Who wants to open this one?
Go ahead, Avi.
I don't know, Dan.
One important point here to launch this important theme that Caroline has raised now is that Jews in the diaspora have been placed in a to quote Camus, no exit, in a completely impossible situation, which is really a function of the strategy of the PLO and the Soviets, which is that if you want to be woke, if you want to be morally acceptable to this new remade Western society, you can either divorce yourself from the source of collective evil in the world, which is only, in their view, the state of Israel, or you can either passively or actively attach yourself to the only source of collective evil in the world, which are sovereign Jews, which is the Jewish state. So this strategy is exactly what generates an Orly Rappaport-led Crimson editorial and this new legitimized, mainstreamed anti-Semitism on campus. Is that you have a choice. You as a Jew have a choice. Divorce yourself from the source of collective evil, or try to and be okay, be woke, and remake the world in a new John Lennon imagined reality, or you are marked for social and political death and physical violence. So this is the catch-22 situation that Jews are in, and there really is nothing that Jews can do. Is a point that Avi's been making over the last 40 minutes. There's really nothing that Jews can do to get out of that. I think the answer really is to attack the source of evil all the time, which I think Israel has done a very poor job in doing. I mean, Israel, the collective Jewish community, is the frontline target here. The secondary target are Jews in the diaspora, and Israel as the frontline target has done a horrible job for fear of losing its a supposed peace partner, the Palestinian Authority, PLO, whose narrative it adopted hook, line, and sinker 25 years ago. So this leads us into the second and final point, and I'm going to hand it off to Avi, which is, Natan Sharansky has said on numerous occasions, it's very difficult for people from the center to the right to criticize the right. It's very difficult for people on the left, center left, to criticize itself and further left. And this is sort of the headlock that the Jewish world has put itself in. Is the right doesn't know how to criticize the right, the left doesn't know how to criticize the left. When I say criticize, I mean to say on the right, go after the source of evil, which is the Palestinian leadership and its entire Weltanschauung, its entire of Weltanschauung, which is collective Jew hatred and individual Jew hatred, by the way. And Israel has got to take the lead in outing and attacking the source of evil in this ideological war. It's an ideological war led by Palestinian leadership, and unless we do that, we're just going to keep treading water and drowning.
Okay, two things. First, let's just, this is more minor, but it's important. When someone like a Mahmoud Abbas goes before a gathering of European leaders and starts spinning these fantasies about Jews poisoning the wells and killing Palestinians that way, and he gets a raucous applause from these European leaders. Who's the problem there? Is it Abbas, who's a Holocaust denier to begin with, who we've all known all along as an anti-Semite? Or is it the European leaders who are embracing this anti-Semitism, who are saying that that's fine, that's good, because we've appointed you to be the innocent victim of the evil, cruel Jews? And I think that the problem is the broader European leaders rather than Abbas himself. Anti-Semitism is a central theme of Palestinian politics in just about everything, but it's not as if we started attacking the Palestinians for that the way they deserve to be, criticize them. I don't think that would change very much in the West, because the real problem is Palestinian supporters of the Palestinians in the West don't care about that, because they're perfectly fine with that kind of anti-Semitism. They just embrace themselves for they embrace the anti-Semites as the innocent victims of the Jews. They pat themselves on their back for their courage in being willing to face the criticism of Jews who call everybody anti-Semites, and they double down on their actions against Jews. So I don't think that there's the answer is to focus on the Palestinians simply because the anti-Semites in the West don't care. Okay, then you get to the second part, like what is the role of diaspora Jews in this? And I think actually, let's take a non-Israel example for a moment. Okay, there's this wave of legislation going across Europe right now to ban kosher slaughter of meat. Right, and that's clearly anti-Semitic. Now, it's not only anti-Semitic. There are two motives, right? One of the motives is to discourage Muslim immigration to those countries, and the second motive, or maybe the dominant motive, is it's anti-Jewish. Right now, the thing is, most Jews don't actually care about kosher laws. Most Jews don't observe kosher laws, right? But nobody among them, those who don't observe it, they have no difficulty understanding that it's anti-Semitic legislation. When you're trying to ban circumcision of boys, or you're trying to ban Saturday Sabbath observance, or you're trying to ban kosher slaughter, right? It's true that a lot of Jews don't follow these customs, but the one thing that unites all of them is they're all done by Jews, and they may be done by other people, but not by the same people, right? The Saturday Sabbath observance is not done by the same people who do male circumcision. And when you have this wave of legislation, nobody has a problem understanding that's what it is. All of a sudden, when it comes to Israel, and you have a mass of actions to boycott Jews, allegedly because of crimes of the Jewish state, then all of a sudden in the Jewish community, people are flummoxed, right? You don't have the equivalent of J Street on kosher slaughter, an organization of Jews, or primarily Jews, that lobbies in favor of banning kosher slaughter, allegedly to protect animal welfare. Right? You don't have the equivalent of J Street on male circumcision, where you have this mass organization lobbying to ban circumcision of boys, allegedly on the grounds of child welfare. On the other hand, when it comes,
but why is that? Why is there no J Street of kosher slaughter and circumcision?
It's because of the way the rest of the diaspora Jewish community reacts to them. Instead of calling them out for what they are, They're flummoxed. Right? Instead of saying that J Street is simply a very thin cover for a group of anti-Semites, J Street lobbies for the Iranian genocide against Israel, against Jews, right? J Street lobbies for Palestinian terrorists who kill Jews, right? You have groups that are flummoxed. They don't know what to do with them. They don't want to get into policy arguments.
But here's a question. I don't know, maybe you were planning on answering it anyway, but let me just ask it anyway. I mean, you know, the best friend that the Jews of the United States had against this wave of this tsunami of Jew hatred from the left that's organized around the demonization of the Jewish state was President Trump. I mean, he signed the executive order making BDS, you know, protecting Jewish students on campus from BDS activism, and recognizing that this is a form of Jew hatred and persecution of Jews on college campuses. And he got very little to no support from the organized Jewish leadership, even if they said that this was a good thing. They all have, you know, denigrated him and alleged that he's an anti-Semite, and campaigned very, very hard for Biden and for Clinton, you know, in 2016. And so, you know, you have that, and then the question becomes, or it's not really a question, I guess it's more like a list of, you know, what is more central, or does it really matter? Is it a conviction? Is it a desire that, you know, to want to be part of these leftist institutions that are propagating this anti-Jewish campaign? I mean, I just saw a couple of days ago that Princeton, for instance, you know, they used to, my brother went to Princeton, and it used to be around 20% Jewish. It was always they had one of the lower levels of Jewish enrollment than the other Ivy Leagues, but they had a significant Jewish community, and now only 2% of the undergraduate population at Princeton is Jewish. So that, you know, Jews are disappearing from campuses. Campuses are becoming much less Jewish, much more anti-Jewish, much more Arab, much more woke, obviously. But that there's this desire still among Jews to be part of. They still value most Ivy League institutions and elite credentials, and therefore they don't want to go against it. Or is it part of this identification and lack of awareness of either lack of awareness or awareness and agreement with the hatred of Jews, because they are woke themselves, and their woke identity has replaced a Jewish identity for so many American Jews? I mean, is it that they identify with this, or is it that they want the credentials and it's they prefer, as Dan said, not to be socially, you know, become social pariahs? Is it out of convenience or out of conviction that the Jews are not seeing, that are joining J Street, are giving them lots of money, and they're refusing to see the anti-Semitic nature of this organization that exists to advance it?
I think the conviction follows from the convenience. That is, it's much better to have bleached skin in this world, so they're convincing themselves that bleaching their skin is the right thing and is the moral imperative of the day. But I don't think we're going to make a lot of headway going after individual Jews who are too weak of character to exercise their conscience. I think that we have to focus our criticism and our efforts on leaders in the Jewish community who are simply failing to act, or worse, are joining up with the anti-Semites. And so you have Israel studies and Jewish studies programs on campuses around the United States, where they are, for the most part, purveyors of this kind of anti-Semitism more than anything else. And
can you give an example? Can you give an example of that playing out?
Myers at UCLA, right? Ian Lustig, who's now stepping down at Penn, right? you go through figure after figure. They're at the center of anti-Semitic activity on campus, on propagating anti-Semitic propaganda as scholarship, right? And
this is around the concept of Israel, though, Avi. Mention it. In other words, Lustig, these guys take Israel as the collective Jewish anchor, and anti-Semitism comes out of that.
That's right. I think that's right, but I also think it's really not relevant. That is, in the following sense. Okay, so when people are doing their anti-Semitism as part of eugenics, I don't think we win the argument by talking about the better way to understand eugenics, right? When they're phrasing their hatred of Jews as a collective by talking about the Jewish state rather than the Jewish religion or about a Jewish custom, I don't think we make a lot of headway by confining ourselves to the box that they're in. I think that what we have to see the bigger picture is there's a straight line continuity between these different kinds of anti-Semitism, where they're expressed in the language of Christ killing or eugenics or the evil of the Jewish state. They borrow from one another their themes, right? So the Crimson editorial we were talking about borrows all the themes of pernicious Jewish power and Jews killing children, right? And all of the things that you see in all the different kinds of anti-Semitism, they borrow liberally from one another. And we shouldn't pretend that they're separate when they're not. But at any rate, the main point is not, I don't think the main point is to engage in their language. The main point is to try to get at them, right? Now, the reason that all these people hold their positions is because primarily Jewish donors over the years have thrown money at them in order to hire these people. The reason that prominent Democrats have backed the progressive anti-Semites is because Jewish donors have continued to throw money at them, right? The reason that Trump was punished for philo-Semitic, for pro-Jewish policies, was because Jewish donors were throwing money at people who are going after Trump on those grounds. And so I think that, where we have to go at, this is not a question of trying to convince Ian Lustig. Ian Lustig is a lost cause if there ever was one, as much as Peter Beinart or any one of the other people who bleach their skin. I think that the real issue is to go after people whose convenience and as married to their conviction, where they've decided that they want to feel their weight in the Democratic Party by backing the enemies of the Jewish people. And we have to get at them. We have to force them to confront the anti-Semites. And the same thing for the large Jewish organizations that have meekly cowed to the people from Hayes and J Street and the rest of the organizations that engage in anti-Semitism, and for fear of breaking unity, have brought the anti-Semites into these institutions. We have to push them out. We have to push the people who still care, the people who are still engaged, to take a stand. Because if we don't do it now, it's not going to. All that's going to happen is these institutions will be totally lost to us. Maybe they are.
Well, I mean, that's the question that I want to pose to you, Dan, because you have your finger on the pulse of a lot of these different organizations, and you work with them. There's a growing sense in Israel, particularly in the Israeli right, which is that forget it. There's no point, that these American Jews are lost. They're not going to fight. Trying to win over the hearts and minds of the American Jewish community, of the American Jewish leadership, that they're going to do anything for Israel, that they're going to be allies in the fight against Jew hatred in its current form, and its contemporary Jew hatred, which is centered around Israel. That we just have to forget about it, because they're not doing anything, just like they did so little and too little too late to fight the annihilation of European Jewry. American Jews are again exposing themselves as weak, much more interested in being accepted by the elites in the United States than protecting themselves and their civil rights as Jews in the United States. And, let's just throw in the towel. Let's focus on the things that we can actually achieve. And Israeli Jews cannot achieve any significant headway with an American Jewish institutional world where you see those institutions corrupted from the inside by people who are weak and who just want to be embraced by increasingly anti-Semitic Democrats and get prestige at increasingly anti-Semitic elite institutions like Harvard. I mean, what do you answer that? And how do you see the Jewish institutional response adapting as anti-Semitism and elite institution that the Jews have always sought the embrace of becomes more and more toxic?
Carolyn, the data tells us that there's room for optimism. The data on American Jewish life and its affiliation and identification with the state of Israel is still in the area of 60%. So
among Americans or among American?
Yeah, among American Jews. American Jews. And now this is it. I'm not doing a demographic cut within clearly the 20 to 40 sector is much more challenged than the 40 to 80 sector.
We're talking about age groups.
Age groups. Yeah. Age sector. Yeah. Age category. But overall, well over 60% of American Jewry still identifies with Israel and they identify as Zionists with Israel. So all is not lost. The point we really have to, as we end our discussion, but a discussion that's only beginning and continuing, is where did this anti-Semitism crawl? It didn't just happen. This is not the Big Bang. It is not, as they say in Hebrew, yesh me'ayin. It didn't happen between 1967 and 1993 when Israel conquered Judea, Samaria, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. It happened when the collective Jewish community, which is the anchor and the focus and the center of American Jewish identity in the post-war period, decided to collapse and sold out its rights and its entire raison d'etre to its archenemy. That is in my view and in the view of others, one of the central reasons that we have today this virulent strain of new anti-Semitism and as well as classic anti-Semitism. The Jewish institutional world in the United States looks to Israel as an example. It looks to Israel as to say, where are we today? That without a strong, much more united Israel position against its enemies, it will continue to enable or allow the United States Jewish community, which is already weak, frightened, convenience-driven, socially pressured, and assimilating at an unprecedented rate in the post-World War II era, to continue to slide down that slippery slope that we talked about an hour ago when we opened this discussion about the Harvard Crimson eliminationist, proud eliminationist screed against the Jewish people and the nation state and its nation state. So in summary, I would say that the leadership of the Jewish world has to take a principled stand for the collective Jewish world against anti-Semitism, as Avi has said, which can be thread from all different versions and all different flavors and all different types. But at the end of the day, Sharansky has said this, and again I bring up Sharansky's name because he's really brilliant on this issue. The focal point, the center of gravity of Jewish international identity in this post-war era is still the Jewish collective in Israel. And therefore, I think that because that we in Israel are very much a large part, if not the main part of the answer to the challenges of anti-Semitism at Harvard, at Columbia, at the University of San Diego, in Europe, that we are facing. And until Israel takes a principled position and blasts the European Union every time it comes out with an anti-Semitic expression, as Avi talked about the standing ovation that Mahmoud Abbas got in 2018 from the European Commission, there was no major Israeli outrage at that particular super anti-Semitic on steroids expression by the European Union. And until Israel, and neither was there, by the way, at the Durban I conference, which was the heart and soul, the genesis of the anti-Semitic apartheid movement we see today. And until Israel takes a united position, a morally centric united position, I think things will only get worse in the international diaspora, who looks to Israel as a moral example of how they should behave as Jews, and not to be sucked in to this Palestinian-driven, progressive-driven, radical-driven, Mark Lamont Hill-driven, wokeism, Black Lives Matter, complete racial, social remaking of the American Jewish community.
All right, Avi, I want you to your last remark, and then I'll just close about where this is taking us. The expansion, the mainstreaming, the escalation of the anti-Semitic campaign by woke revolutionaries. What does this mean for American-Israel relations? Leaving aside the Jewish community, we see more and more graduates of these elite institutions, whether it's Meir Bitar or now the new press secretary, what's her name, Corinne Jean-Pierre. These are spokespeople. These are supporters, advocates for BDS, for viewing Israel as a pariah state, and they're now taking key positions in the Biden administration. So where do you see this impacting in the long term the future of Israel-U.S. relations?
Well, let's understand there's a very different phenomenon than what Dan was just talking about, because I think that Dan is absolutely right that the Israeli leadership has failed to call out pervasive anti-Semitism in European rhetoric and actions. It's failed to call out pervasive anti-Semitism in Palestinian rhetoric and actions, and in so many other places in the world, and it's done so only for political reasons of late. So you look at the way that just take this current government, the way it responded to anti-Semitic comments, first by the Ukrainian president addressing the Knesset, where he engaged in really some horrible Holocaust denial, in which he was claiming that the Ukrainians rescued Jews, ignoring the nearly 100,000 Ukrainians that volunteered for the SS in order to murder Jews, right? And then the anti-Semitic comments of Russia's foreign minister, in which he fabricated some a Jewish descent for Hitler, and the government blew up about the Russian anti-Semitism and kept completely silent about the Ukrainian anti-Semitism. Because of some ridiculous sense that right now the Biden administration wants to hear criticism of Russia but not criticism of the Ukraine, and therefore we can't call out Ukrainian anti-Semitism. I think we should be calling out everybody's anti-Semitism, and the Jewish institutions in the United States have to be calling out anti-Semitism there as well. And it makes no difference how many Jews in the United States are consciously Zionist any more than how many consciously observe the Sabbath. Attacking the Jewish collective as such is anti-Semitism, and Jewish institutions have to speak about that. That said, we don't control, neither Jewish institutions nor Israel control what's happening in the Democratic Party. Right. Right now in the Democratic Party, there is a minority, a Marxist progressive woke minority that's driving the agenda. And that agenda is, among other things, anti-Semitic. And that anti-Semitism is not passive and it's not purely domestic. A lot of that anti-Semitism is directed at organizing hatred and discrimination against the Jewish state. Now, what can we do about it? The answer, unfortunately, is little. There are some things we can do. That is, Jewish donors to the Democratic Party can start paying attention and cut off funds to anybody who doesn't take active steps to drive the progressives out of their positions of power in the party. And there are Jewish donors in the United States who have reasonably significant roles, who can exercise some influence. There are some subjects where Israel can stand up to American pressure and say, no, we're not going to endorse this theory that non-Jews have property rights, Jews don't have property rights. Non-Jews have worship rights, Jews do not have worship rights. We can't endorse these kinds of anti-Semitic theories. We're not going to, right? But that said, ultimately, this is a fight. What's going on in the Democratic Party in the United States is what happened in the Labour Party in the UK. It's their fight. It's not ours. We're going to be the victims if the bad guys win. But we don't control that, right? We just have to be aware of the risk.
Right. I think one of the things that, if I may give my takeaway on this, I mean, I think that, one of the things that we have to really see is that, for a long time, and people like Alan Dershowitz as well, they would say on the left, liberal Jews, more than progressive Jews, but liberal Jews who would say, I'm pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian or pro-Palestine. I believe in a two-state solution. I think that this is the way to go. And there's no contradiction between the two. And then people like myself on the right have been saying, actually, that's not true, because the Palestinian national movement, such as it is a genocidal movement against the Jews, and that it cannot, as it is proven over and over again, it is unappeasable. It has been offered, all of the things that it's supposed to want numerous times since 1933 with the Peel Commission, and it has never accepted these things. It has never accepted. It has never accepted partition of the land of Israel east of the Jordan River. West of the Jordan River, and it won't. And so this concept that you can be both. It sounded nice for an awfully long time, and many people believed it. But I think that what we're seeing now is that the slippery slope has reached its destination. And when you see on the ground that everybody in positions of leadership in the Palestinian Arab world are all saying the exact same thing, that Jews have filthy feet, whether they're the prime minister of Jordan or the head of Hamas, and that they're infecting the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa. And when you're seeing people calling for the butchery of Jews and then Jews being butchered as a consequence, whether it's the head of Hamas or leaders in Fatah that are supported by Mahmoud Abbas, then we have to understand that the concept that you can be both, that you can sit on the fence, that you can be everybody's friend, is now defunct. And it's time to stand up and decide who you're with. And the Harvard Crimson and Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, all of these liberal elite or progressive elite institutions and organizations have put their cards on the table and said, we're with the people hacking Jews with axes. That's who we stand with. And it's about time that all of these other people recognize that this is an either or proposition, and it's very difficult, as a practical matter, to make a clear statement. But in the absence of a clear statement, you end up supporting and legitimizing people who say that Israel is a Nazi state that doesn't have a right to exist, and by rights ought to be annihilated, whether by an Iranian nuclear bomb or by Palestinians wielding axes or suicide bombers or what have you. And I think that we have reached that point, and it has come to this. And when you understand the stakes, it's also much easier to fight this war. And obviously, I think that Dan is absolutely right, that when Israel decided to legitimize the PLO in 1993 and accept the lie that the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, such as they are, that it essentially denied itself, the Jewish state denied itself the ability to make the case for itself. And that has to end as well. And we see that with, Yair Lapid's claim that anti-Semitism is just another form of hatred, and it's no different from Hutus and Tutsis who kill each other, or any other genocide, or any other attempt to discriminate against minorities or slavery in the United States, and so on and so forth. And so I think that, these are times that Israel and its supporters, Jews and non-Jews in the West, have to stand up and say, we stand with Israel, and Israelis and the Israeli government has to stand up and say, we stand for our rights and we're going to protect our rights. And everywhere that they're under attack, we're going to defend them. And so I hope all of you watching have learned from our discussion today, and that you take the point that this is the time, nobody wants to be in a time for choosing, but we are in one, and maybe we always are. But when so much is at stake, you have to really recognize that if you don't stand up, then you're going to get crushed. And that's what's happening on campuses, and that's what's happening, unfortunately, also in the streets of Israel. And we have to stand up here in Israel, and Jews around the world have to stand up where they are. So on that note, and with that battle cry, we're going to sign off for this week. Subscribe to the channels at JNS or Caroline Glick Mideast News Hour on YouTube, on Rumble, on Snap, on I don't know, all of them, Spotify, everywhere. And tell your friends, share this information. I think it's absolutely essential that we all understand what's going on. And I'll just bid a final farewell to Avi Bell, Professor Avi Bell, and to Mr. Dan Diker, both experts on all things related to, all things related to Jews and so much more. So thank you both for joining me today. It was a real pleasure, and we'll have you back soon.
Thank you, Caroline.
Dan. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Avi. Terrific.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.